Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today's unit, we are going to be talking about lipids. So we'll talk about some of the general functions associated with lipids, as well as what is their effect on our sport performance. So let's start with some of the common properties that we see within lipids. So it turns out that humans need very little fat in their diets in order for us to maintain health. And the reason for that is if we look at those macronutrients in general, we can take our carbohydrates, we can take our proteins, and we can convert those into fat very easily. So as it relates to, general function associated with those fats, we can make them from so many other nutrients that it's not necessary that we have a lot of them within our diets. So we can intake as little as 10% of our total calories from fats. The recommendation is up to 35% of our total calories coming from fats, with an emphasis on minimizing saturated and trans fats. So again, we want to try to focus on unsaturated, either polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fats, as well as like the omega-3 fatty acids within our diet, and kind of minimize some of those saturated fats. And again, we'll talk about what are some particular nutrients that contain either of those. So what are some of the common properties that we see within the actual triglyceride molecule? So triglyceride is going to be our kind of the basic chemical configuration of a fat. And a triglyceride, let's see if I can draw one for you, is going to be made of kind of this glycerol backbone, and then we're going to have like these three fatty acid tails coming off of the side of it. Okay, so tri means three, so we've got three fat molecules kind of coming off of the side of this glyceride molecule. Okay. Other factors associated with our fats in general, lipids don't dissolve readily in water, so they're known as hydrophobic. So hydro means water, phobic means a fear of. So they don't like to be in water, and so what happens when we put fats in water is they kind of cling to themselves, which allows us to create like these kind of like fat globules. If you've ever put, like oil and water together, you'll notice that the oil kind of like chunks together a little bit, and that's because it is hydrophobic in nature. Okay. A couple general statements. So liquid lipids or oils generally come from plant products, whereas solid lipids, known as fats, are going to usually come from animal products. When we look at the composition of those fats, essentially we can kind of classify them based on what's going on with these fatty acid tails. And we can have unsaturated or saturated fats. The saturated fats are going to be more common in those plant products, and the unsaturated fats are going to be found in these plant products, whereas the animal products will contain more of the saturated fats. Okay, and we'll take a look at what those mean here in just a couple of seconds. So where we have triglycerides stored within the body, three different locations. One is adipose tissue, and adipose tissue is just the same thing as like our fat mass or fat tissue or fat cells. So again, we can have those fat cells or those adipose cells kind of everywhere in the body. They're kind of spread out all over the place. And one interesting thing when we think about these fat molecules is we cannot necessarily lose any of those fat molecules. So if you have somebody that like loses weight, for example, we can modify the size of those cells pretty drastically. So those cells can get really enlarged if we have a lot of fat stored in them, or they can shrink down if we lose weight. So we don't necessarily change the number of cells that we have, we just change what's stored within them. So I think that's kind of interesting. So adipose tissue or fat cells is one location. Number two is going to be within the liver. Again, remember that the liver's job is kind of to serve as this processing location for all of our nutrients, among other many other things that it can do. But we are going to have some fat stored within the liver. And then lastly, we have fat stored in our skeletal muscle, which is kind of a surprise to a lot of people. But again, this is kind of a weird example, but if you think about the difference between, if you were to eat like dark meat chicken versus versus like a chicken breast, right? So like the dark meat is found in the thigh, for example. And in my opinion, the thigh tastes much better than the chicken breast. And it's kind of darker in nature. It's like we call it dark meat. And the reason is because there's more fat stored within that particular muscle of the chicken, right? So again, if you think about the life of a chicken, right? Their breast doesn't really do much as it relates to their function, whereas their thighs are used in order for them to like run around. So they have a lot more fat stored in the thigh area because those are the fats that they need to mobilize in order to move, in order to run around or whatever they need to do. And so that's why we see more fat stored like in the dark meat of a chicken, and that's why it tastes better, in my opinion, versus the breast, which it has less fat stored. It's considered white meat because they're not using that muscle for a lot of like aerobic work, for example. Okay. So when we think about skeletal muscle as a location for fat storage, the fat is actually stored like around the muscle cells or between the muscle cells. Okay, so again, imagine this kind of conglomeration of a bunch of cells like in this like package kind of. The fat is like in between the cells. It's considered intramuscular fat storage. So again, we're going to kind of store that between each of those cells, and therefore that fat is right there and ready to go if I'm going to do any type of, you know, aerobic work that's going to require me to use that as a fuel. So let's take a look at the fatty acids. So again, we said that a triglyceride molecule is made up of glycerol backbone and then 3 fatty acid tails. So let's take a look at what's going on with these fatty acids. Okay, so again, it's essentially a carbon chain bonded by hydrogen ions. Okay, and so when we think about the difference between the different types of fatty acid chains that we can have, again, we've already mentioned the term saturated fatty acid, mono, unsaturated, polyunsaturated, and trans fats. Okay, so in general, again, another common misconception is we say like, oh, you know, animal products have more saturated fat in them. Yes, that's true. They have more saturated fat in them, but that doesn't mean all the fats within an animal product is saturated in nature. It might be 60%, for example. So again, when we think about the composition of any food that we're consuming, it's going to contain a mixture of many of these fatty acids a lot of times. So again, let me kind of give you a general idea about what's the difference between each of these fatty acids, and then I think I have some images coming up that will maybe illustrate this a little bit better. So when we think about saturated fatty acids, let's see if I can draw this. So essentially, if each of these is a carbon, okay, a carbon molecule, it has several different like connections that it needs to make. And when I have a saturated fatty acid, each carbon, think of it as like a little string or a little bond, is filled with a hydrogen molecule. Okay, with a monounsaturated fat, not all of those bonds are filled with hydrogen, so therefore the bonds will create what's known as a double bond. Okay, so again, think about it this way. If this is my carbon molecule and I have 4 bonds that come off of there, in the saturated version, each of these bonds is filled with a hydrogen molecule. Okay, with an unsaturated fat, not every single bond is filled. Okay, so instead of having 4 hydrogens around this one carbon molecule, with an unsaturated fat, no, I'm sorry, I'm drawing. So with an unsaturated fat, I'm going to make a double bond. So basically, like I'm getting 1 bond from the right side and 1 bond from the left side, and those are going to connect to the carbon molecules, as opposed to having each bond saturated with a hydrogen molecule. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to say is if I had a saturated fat, each of these carbons would be filled with 4 hydrogen molecules. Okay, with an unsaturated fat, I have this double bond, so now I only have 6 hydrogen molecules in this particular configuration. Okay, so monounsaturated, mono means one. That means that there's one bond that's not completely saturated. So there's one double bond between the carbon molecules. Okay, poly means many. So with a polyunsaturated fatty acid, I'm going to have multiple double bonds. Okay, trans fat, I'm going to show you what this looks like on the next couple slides, but essentially with a trans fat, we've chemically modified something that was unsaturated to make it seem more saturated in nature. And the reason for that is it allows us to change the like the density of the fat. So basically, like with saturated fats, a lot of times most of the time they're more solid in nature, and these unsaturated fats are more liquid in nature. And again, if you think about the configuration, you know, if I have a lot of hydrogen molecules, for example, it's really crowded. So imagine, you know, downtown Chicago or something along those lines where I've got a lot of houses like really close together. Okay. And so, you know, when we think about that, it's really crowded. So there's not a lot of room for those molecules to move around. So it's more solid in nature. Okay. With the unsaturated fats, again, think about, you know, someplace out in the country where the houses are more spread out, for example. And so now when I try to move that configuration, there's more room. So those molecules have more room to kind of move around and be manipulated. And so therefore they're going to be more liquidy in nature. Okay. So if I take something that's unsaturated and I basically inject it from a chemical standpoint with hydrogen molecules, that's going to allow the molecule to become more solid in nature. And the benefit for that is it's going to allow me to create like a solid, more solid food, and it kind of tastes better too. So again, we can modify things from a chemical standpoint to, you know, make the taste better, but also change the configuration of that molecule from, for example, liquid to solid. Okay, so here you can kind of see that example. So with the saturated fats, again, notice that of those 4 bonds, every bond is filled. Okay, so every bond coming off of that carbon molecule is filled. And so therefore, you know, things are pretty crowded in this particular setup. So that's the saturated setup. And with the unsaturated setup, again, notice that these 2 bonds were not filled, and so therefore they're going to make a double bond or a double, you know, connection basically, and that allows us to have more free space. So we've got more freedom over here, which means that these molecules are going to be easier to move around basically, and so again, that unsaturated fat will be more liquid in nature in comparison to the solid or saturated configuration. Okay, so this kind of shows us a couple more examples. So here you can see that polyunsaturated fatty acid. And again, with the polyunsaturated fatty acid, we have multiple double bonds. So again, you can see there's 3 double bonds going on, which would again allow it to be even more fluid in nature in comparison to the monounsaturated fatty acid. And here you can see with the trans fatty acid, I have some chemical injection of these hydrogen molecules, which allows me to modify this molecule from a chemical standpoint. Okay. So again, we mentioned that, you know, a lot of times we think about foods as it relates to being, you know, oh, this type of food is saturated, this type of food is unsaturated. And that's kind of true, but in reality, everything's kind of a mixture of both. So here you can see, for example, let's see, lard. Okay, so again, lard is an animal product. So again, we expect it to be pretty saturated. So again, it's got 43% saturated fat here, but actually 47% of monounsaturated fats. So again, kind of the idea here is that, you know, these molecules or these foods are going to be made up of a mixture of many different fats. Here you can see, let's take a look at olive oil, for example, which is considered a healthy fat, is made up of about 15% saturated fats and 75% unsaturated. So again, that is desirable. We want to kind of maximize unsaturated and minimize the amount of saturated fats that we have. So again, that's one of the reasons why we would say olive oil is one of our best oils or one of our best fats as it relates to kind of general health. Okay. So again, we think about, what types of foods are going to be high in fats. I mean, it's basically everything that tastes good. So fats are very high in calorie density. So 1 gram of fats is equal to 9 calories per gram. So again, it's more than double what we see from a caloric standpoint when we look at, for example, carbohydrates or proteins. And so, again, eating a small amount of fats gives us a large amount of calories. Okay, so again, 1 serving of mayonnaise, for example, is about 100 calories, and that's really not that much. 1 serving is like 1 tablespoon. Okay, so again, some examples of foods that are high in fats: we've got mayonnaise, salad oils, butter, margarine, different types of nuts, bacon, avocado, peanut butter, cheese, chocolate, ice cream, any type of sweets, generally, and then, eggs, cupcakes, all of my favorite foods listed on this slide, right? So again, we mentioned saturated fats being high within our animal products. About 60% of the fat within animal products will be saturated in nature. What's the problem with this? We see that, foods that are high in saturated fat will be linked to issues with obesity, hypertension, high cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, an increase in blood clotting, which could lead to stroke or some other, major health implications. So when we think about our general health, we certainly want to kind of minimize the amount of saturated fats that we're consuming because they put us at risk for some of these major health implications down the road. Again, does that matter for our athletes? Yes and no. If you're working with high school athletes and you tell them, like, hey, this is going to give you high cholesterol and you're going to have to worry about cardiovascular disease, they're going to be like, I don't care about that. I'm, 17 years old and skinny and healthy as far as they know. So again, we think about, the selling point of how to eat right. I don't find that to be an effective approach when working with athletes. So when we think about some of these health implications, that doesn't really mean a lot to them, in my personal experience. So again, they're not motivated to eat well based on some of these health related things. They might be interested in eating healthier from a weight management perspective. So that might be a more powerful message to send to them as opposed to maybe some of these chronic diseases that could happen, 30, 40 years down the road for them. Everybody's different, but again, when we think about kind of how to sell healthy eating to our athletes, we've got to think about what's valuable to them. And to be honest, I just don't think this is super valuable to them at this point in their lives. We've got to find another way to show them that this is valuable when we think about, giving them nutrition advice. Okay. Again, unsaturated fats will be more prevalent in our plant products. So about 75 to 95% of our fats within the plant products will be made of these unsaturated fats, and it could be a combination of the polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats. So what about the use of reduced fat foods? So again, we mentioned that saturated fats are not great. They're going to put us at risk for all these chronic issues. So should we do something else? Should we use some other item? Would it be better to use a reduced fat food? So again, a lot of manufacturers will market reduced fat foods as kind of like a healthy alternative. And in order for them to say that they have reduced fat, they have to have, I believe it's around 20% less fat than the original content. Okay, so fat content and these products may be 0 to 75% of the original fat content of the product. I think it's a minimum of 10% in order for them to actually be able to label that way from an FDA standpoint. But the issue with using like reduced fat versus the regular version of these foods is when we look at the total energy or the total amount of calories that's provided by that product, it's not usually lower than what the original product was giving us. Okay, so again, if I take out fat, usually what happens is I'm going to replace that fat with something else, and usually that means we're going to replace it with carbs or sugars. Okay, so let's take a look. I have an example of what this looks like here. So here you can see two different two different nutrition labels. We've got on the left side your regular version, and on the right side you have your reduced fat version. And these nutrition labels came from ice cream. So here you can see, the regular version actually has significantly less calories than the no fat version. Okay, so the regular version has 8 grams of carbs, 4 grams of fats, and it gives us a total of 100 calories. Then we look at the reduced fat version. Protein intake stays the same, so protein content was not modified. But then we look at carbohydrates, we went from 8 grams to 30 grams in our kind of low fat version, or no fat version in this particular example. But we actually increased the calorie intake. Okay, so we went from 100 calories to 150 calories in the same serving. So again, those are things to kind of keep in mind and pay attention to when we think about, what items we want to choose. A lot of times, as we mentioned, the manufacturers can be a little bit sneaky about their marketing in terms of trying to say like, hey, this is a healthier option for you, when in reality looks like the regular version might be a better choice from a caloric standpoint than the non-fat version. Okay. So again, we've talked a little bit about what are some foods that contain lipids, and what are kind of some of the negative implications associated with over consuming them, but what do we need them for? So what is their function within the body, right? So again, 4 major functions associated with the use or the consumption or the mechanism by which we might use lipids. So number 1 is providing energy for the body. And again, we know that we'll use lipids for kind of low intensity, long duration types of things. We're also going to use lipids as a fuel source when we are at rest. Okay. Number 2 is storing energy for later use. So again, our body would like to kind of maintain this at least minimal amount of fat storage within the body, and that's going to allow us to have some fuel reserve if we get in a situation where maybe we don't have access to foods, or we're doing something, from a fight or flight perspective where I need to tap into those reserves in order to survive. We have those available. So number 1 was providing energy for the body to use. Number 2, storing energy for later use. Number 3, insulating and protecting the body. So again, we do have fat stored subcutaneously, which means underneath our skin, and that'll serve as a little bit of insulation for us. We also have some fats that are going to be around, for example, some of the internal organs that we have. And again, that's going to help us to maybe create a little bit of a cushion so that those organs aren't having any abrasive forces against each other, and they can kind of live in harmony within the thorax, for example. And then lastly, number 4 is transporting fat-soluble vitamins. So we can store fat-soluble vitamins within the fat tissue or within the adipose cells. And so that's a great place for us to store, both fats and those vitamins at the same time. Okay. Again, one thing to note when we think about these functions, these unique functions of lipids, is that this isn't just fats. For example, we can convert any type of calories that we consume into fats and use them for these functions. Okay, so fats are very, very chemically stable. So our body likes to store things in the form of fat because it's stable and it's easy to maintain. So we can very easily convert those proteins or those carbs into fats if we're over consuming them, and we've kind of tapped out what their functions are and what our needs are as it relates to those two particular types of nutrients. So again, one of the major functions we mentioned was to provide energy for the body, and triglycerides will serve as our main fuel for 3 different scenarios. So number 1 is our main fuel for our muscles while we're at rest. Number 2, during light activity. So again, we will use fats as a fuel when we're doing light or low intensity activity. And then number 3 is endurance exercise over 60 to 90 minutes. As we said, we can store fats for energy for later use. And unfortunately, our body's ability to store fat is basically limitless. Okay, so again, we can continue to store and store and store, which is why obesity is such a huge issue in our country. Adipose cells, again, we already mentioned this, we can't necessarily change the number of cells that we have. However, we can increase the size of one cell by 50 times. So that is that's a huge difference between, kind of where we started. As I already mentioned, triglycerides are very chemically stable, so therefore it's a very safe and effective way for us to store energy. The other thing to note when we think about the storage of fats is it doesn't require us to store a lot of water with them as well. So an adipose cell, for example, will contain about 80% lipid and 20% water, which is not very much water in the grand scheme of things when we think about the composition of water or fluid within a muscle, for example. So again, this is a very easy way for us to store. As we mentioned, we can have fats for insulating and protecting the body. So again, we mentioned subcutaneous fat, which is basically the fat that's found underneath our skin. And again, that's going to serve as a great insulator for us. Also, I mentioned that, we're going to have some fat that's going to surround and protect some of our internal organs. And this makes up a component of our body composition known as our essential fats. And essential fat levels are going to be different for our males and our females. But basically, essential fat is the minimum amount of fat needed in order for us to maintain our basic physiologic function. Okay. So again, in order for us to be able to continue with reproduction is really the major factor, but be able to, maintain the health of our cells. For example, the cell membranes have some fat components in them. It's really important that we maintain body fat percentage above these kind of essential kind of baseline levels. Okay, so essential fat levels for males are somewhere between 2 to 5%. So again, I need a minimum of 2 to 5% of body fat in order for a male to be able to effectively be able to continue with reproduction. And as we mentioned, just kind of maintain some of those other kind of basic functions within the body. Okay. For our females, essential fat levels are going to be significantly higher. And the reason for that is our reproductive processes. So again, women need to have more fat stored kind of in general in order for reproduction to occur, because we need to have fats available to feed baby if baby becomes implanted and a female becomes pregnant. And then also the other thing is when a woman goes into labor, women can be in labor for like 72 hours or something crazy like that. My labors have all been very fast, so I have not experienced that. But essentially, you need to have fat storage so that if I get myself in this situation where I'm going to need calories for 72 hours, I have the energy to do so. Okay. So essential fat levels for our females are somewhere between 10 to 13%, kind of as that minimum level in order for females to, again, maintain normal physiologic function, but, also have the possibility of the reproductive pathways being healthy and able to function. Okay. As we mentioned, transporting fat-soluble vitamins. So again, triglycerides are going to kind of store those fat-soluble vitamins. They're also going to serve as we mentioned, kind of transporters. Okay. So after fats and these vitamins are absorbed, so once their movement occurs from inside the intestines through the bloodstream to the hepatic portal system, we need to have a transporter for them. Okay. And so in order for us to have that transporter's gotta be made of fat, basically. Okay. 4 different vitamins are made up of our fat soluble vitamins, and we'll talk in more detail about these vitamins and their functions in our vitamin unit, which is coming up. But these vitamins include A, D, E, and K. Okay. So again, fat soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. So let's take a look at phospholipids. This is freaking cool. I like this. So this shows us a component of the cell membrane. So again, we said we needed kind of a minimum amount of fat in order for us to just maintain basic physiologic function. This is one of the most important components of physiologic function as it relates to, jobs of the fat molecules. So here you can see that this is like one little component of the cell membrane. And in the next slide, I've got a picture of, what the whole membrane looks like in general. But basically, the membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so phospholipids. So here you can see we've got this phosphate head, which is here. And this phosphate head is known as hydrophilic. Okay, so hydrophilic means that it's water loving. It likes to be in water, which is good news. Okay, and because all of our cells are basically suspended in some sort of fluids. Okay, and then we've got this double fatty acid tail. Okay, so each of these little tails shooting out here are made of fats, and these are hydrophobic in nature, so they don't like to be around water. Okay, so each component has a hydrophilic head and two hydrophobic tails. Okay, so again, if you were hydrophobic or afraid of water, what would you do? You'd try to hide from the water. And that's exactly what happens when these cell membranes kind of configure themselves. And so here you can see each of these little guys here is one of those phosphate heads. And then notice that the tails are all pointing in, okay? And it's a bilayer. So again, I've got a layer on the outside and I've got a layer on the inside of the cell membrane that creates this lipid or this phospholipid bilayer, okay? So again, those phosphate molecules, which love to be in water, are facing out so that they are kind of immersed in the water. And then those hydrophobic tails are kind of pointing in, which allows them to kind of hide within, next to each other. So they're all together, kind of hiding from the water. And then, like I mentioned, those hydrophilic heads are kind of pointing out and suspended within the water. I think that's kind of cool. Anyway, that's one of the major functions associated with fats, and I just think it's neat. Okay, what about cholesterol? So again, we've heard a lot about, saturated fats, unsaturated fats. What is this cholesterol thing? So cholesterol can come from two different places. We can create cholesterol endogenously. Okay, so that means we can create it from within ourselves, but we can also get it from our diet. Okay, so cholesterol can be made in the body. That's about 2/3 of the cholesterol that we have. So again, when we think about total cholesterol levels for individuals, a lot of that is genetic in nature, because we are creating some of that endogenously. Again, about 1/3 of the cholesterol that we have comes from what we consume. Okay, what do we need cholesterol for? It's going to be important to form some of our hormones, such as testosterone and estrogen. It also serves as a building block for bile salts, which will be important for the breakdown of fat molecules. It is essential for the structure of the cell membrane, as we have already mentioned, and it can serve as a transporter for lipids within the blood. Okay, so cholesterol is going to allow us to kind of serve as like this little, think of it as like a little car. And we've got cholesterol molecules that will pick up fats and take them to like a fat cell to be stored. And that's healthy cholesterol, because that's LDL, so that's unhealthy cholesterol. So the cholesterol molecules that are going to carry fats to the cells to be stored are known as LDL, which is unhealthy. Okay, and then we also have HDL cholesterol, and the HDL cholesterol is a healthy cholesterol, and the job of the HDL cholesterol is to pick up fats from storage and carry them in the blood to like the muscle, for example, so that I can use them as a fuel source. And so people that have high HDL levels are good fat burners. So somebody who does a lot of endurance activity, or low intensity, long duration types of activity, maybe even just walking regularly, those levels are going to be higher because they're better at mobilizing and using fats as a fuel source. So that's a good thing. So again, those are kind of your two different functions when we think about transportation of lipids within the blood. Okay, so we've talked about kind of some of the functions associated with fats. We just mentioned cholesterol as well. How much should we consume? Again, we said we want to have at least 10% of our total calories coming from fats. The average daily recommended allowance is between 25 to 35% of our total calories. Again, we can modify this if we're interested in weight loss, for example. Maybe we want to shoot for kind of the lower end of that spectrum, maybe more like 20 to 25% of our total calories. Really just depends on the individual. Ideally, we want to minimize the amount of saturated fats, trans fats that we're consuming. And if, of the fats that we are consuming, we want to kind of maximize the amount of unsaturated fats that we are intaking. And our cholesterol intake should be somewhere between 200 to 300 milligrams per day. Again, if I'm somebody that kind of has natural high cholesterol, maybe from a genetic standpoint, maybe I want to shoot for lower cholesterol intake than 200 milligrams per day. But this just kind of gives us a kind of a general idea of what the average person should be doing. The American Heart Association recommends that high-risk individuals should kind of reduce their fat intake just a little bit. So maybe closer to 20 to 30% of our total calories coming from fats. Again, what classifies someone as high risk? I would say somebody that is at high risk for cardiovascular disease. So they've got a family history, they are older, they are sedentary, let's see, maybe they have, diabetes, etc. So those are some of the risk factors that we would maybe look for in terms of how we might classify somebody as high risk for, a cardiovascular episode. Okay, so again, we just briefly talked about what are some of the, needs for fat in general. And now we want to take a look at what's going on from a performance perspective as it relates to lipid consumption. So as we already mentioned, we think about fats as it relates to exercise. So as a fuel, fats are predominantly used during low intensity exercise. And again, as the exercise intensity increases, carbohydrates will become our fuel of choice. So when we think about, what are fats contributing to exercise potential or exercise performance, it's pretty minimal for most athletes, right? Unless we're doing some, super long endurance types of things, the role of fats is pretty minimal in the grand scheme of things. So we already talked. So as we've kind of already talked about, fats may serve as our major fuel source during exercise, but their usage is dependent on, the intensity of the exercise. So again, we want to have at least, low or moderate intensity exercise. Duration of the exercise. So again, the longer the exercise bout lasts, the more dominant fats become as our fuel source. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing. So again, the duration of the exercise, so the longer the exercise bout, the more likely it is that we're going to use fats for a fuel. Again, what's kind of that threshold level in order for us to really start using fats as a fuel source? We think it's somewhere between, 45 to 60 minutes when we're really tapping into our fat use or fats as a, metabolic, molecule. However, we think that, really in order for us to kind of maximize fat usage during exercise, it's really got to be above 90 minutes. So again, we think about, how does that correlate or how does that apply to a lot of our sports? It probably doesn't. So again, you can think about this as a contributor during practices, but for a lot of us, during games or competitions, we're not doing something greater than, 60 to 90 minutes in duration. So it's not a huge contributor for us. Then lastly, training status of the individual. So again, highly trained individuals are going to rely more heavily on fats. And the reason for that is, if I'm highly trained, I would prefer to use flat fats, and that's going to allow me to kind of spare my glycogen or spare my carbohydrates so that I can use them kind of in a more high intensity type of situation. So again, we think about some of these components associated with fat use during exercise in order for us to understand the relationship between intensity and fat usage. So at 25% of our VO2 max, so again, that's a pretty low intensity, we're going to stimulate something known as peripheral lipolysis. And peripheral lipolysis is essentially the use of fats or the breakdown of fats in the periphery. And so one thing that's really cool, I think, about, using fats during exercise is, let's say, for example, I'm going for a 90-minute bike ride. Okay. So again, I'm pretty much just using my legs, when we think about the muscles involved in biking. But when I activate my lipolysis, or when I activate fat utilization, I'm actually activating lipolysis everywhere in the body. So not only am I able to access the fat that's located in my legs, for example, I'm also accessing it from kind of all over the place. So you would only be able to access that fat by doing kind of those long duration aerobic exercise bouts. Okay, so if I, continue to increase my intensity, it's thought that fat oxidation is to be the highest, around 65% of VO2 max, and 65% VO2 max is, I would say, a moderate intensity. So a moderate intensity is kind of the maximum as it relates to kind of fat oxidation or fat mobilization. Okay. Once I get to 85% intensity, the rate of fat oxidation is going to decrease. And the reason for that is I'm going to kind of switch over and start to use carbohydrates, because as I reach that 85% point, I'm going to start getting some anaerobic contribution, and that's actually going to kind of shut off some of the fat oxidation pathways. So during exercise, the two major sources of fat in terms of fuel. So number one is free fatty acids that are floating in the blood plasma, and number two is intramuscular triglycerides. Okay, if we increase free fatty acids in the blood, this causes an increase in fat metabolism during exercise via the increase in fat mobilization. So again, what we just talked about on the previous slide with this peripheral lipolysis, the more I can kind of mobilize those fats, the better it is as it relates to fat metabolism. Okay, so again, as a highly trained athlete, you're going to get better at doing those things. You're going to get better at mobilizing fats from those kind of peripheral locations. Okay. As we mentioned, at intensities above 85%, carbs become the major source of energy as we kind of switch over and start to rely on some of those anaerobic pathways. So at these intensities, the reason for this is as we produce lactate, which we know comes from that anaerobic glycolytic pathway, once lactate is produced, the mobilization of fats will be inhibited. So again, we've kind of talked about when are we going to use fats, and again, not super important for many of us in our sports. However, some researchers have looked into, what's the idea here as it relates to acute versus chronic high fat intake. So some researchers have kind of believed in this theory that, if I increase my fat consumption, maybe that could increase my exercise performance because I'm able to use more fats, right? So again, from an endurance perspective, would this be an effective way for us to do this? Okay, so in an acute way, acute intake, so this is going to increase the availability of our circulating fatty acids, but it doesn't result in any clear effects on endurance performance. So again, when we think about acute fat intake, maybe, last night I had maybe a more fatty meal, and then for breakfast I did, and then I had some sort of endurance race or something, late this morning. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily show us that it's going to improve our performance. It can cause more or additional GI distress due to delayed gastric emptying. Okay, so this can cause us some gastric distress or like stomach cramping. You just don't feel great. And the reason for that is the delay in gastric emptying. So again, fats are like heavier in nature and slower for us to break down in comparison to maybe like simple carbs, which is kind of the traditional recommendation for like an endurance athlete. So therefore, not great for us when we think about, consuming fats kind of really close to a performance. Okay, short-term ingestion of high-fat diet, so like 1 to 2 days, leads to deterioration of performance in high-intensity exercise tasks. Again, that makes sense when we think about the metabolic processes associated with doing high-intensity exercise. We don't want to consume fats, right? So we need carbs in order to fuel ourselves appropriately for those particular types of activity. And so by consuming fats, we cannot, transform fats into carbohydrates. That's not an option for us. We can do the other way, but we can't take fats and turn them into carbs or proteins. So therefore, it's really important that we're consuming the appropriate nutrients that we're going to be burning during that particular exercise bout. Okay, what about chronic fat intake? So again, maybe if I just kind of followed like a high fat diet as an endurance athlete, would that make me a better fat burner? And so therefore, could that improve my endurance performance? Some findings have shown some of an ergogenic effect, some have not as it relates to endurance performance. And again, the belief with this particular model is that we might be able to enhance some of our fat burning enzymes. Some researchers have showed trends to improving endurance performance, but some researchers haven't shown any benefit. So again, I guess the verdict's still out as it relates to more of a chronic high fat diet and how that might affect our endurance performance. However, I guess the other side to think about when we think about consuming a high fat diet, even if it does kind of enhance those fat burning enzymes, would be the negative health effects, right? So we think about some of the health effects of consuming a chronically high fat diet. That's going to increase our cholesterol. Does that put us at risk for weight gain? Does that put us at risk for some of these other chronic conditions? Yes, most likely. So again, that's something that we really want to kind of think about. So again, when we think about the use of fats in an acute sense as it relates to performance, fat loading again would kind of be like carbohydrate loading. So again, consuming a large amount of fats, within a short period of time prior to a performance. And the idea with this is we want to increase the availability of circulating free fatty acids. So again, the concept behind this, or the theory, would be by increasing fat intake, we can reduce our reliance on glycogen, which would allow us to save that glycogen for higher intensity situations. However, as we mentioned, this increase in fat intake could cause GI distress or stomach cramping and those sorts of issues, which again then kind of negates the potential benefit associated with consuming a high fat diet in the first place. So again, kind of some takeaway points when we think about the use of fats in an acute way. So the effect on endurance performance, again, fat loading doesn't necessarily result in any clear benefits with endurance performance. And when we think about the effect on high intensity exercise, sorry, there is music going on outside. So the effect on high intensity exercise would lead to a deterioration in performance, because we know that those high intensity exercise tasks are going to rely exclusively on carbohydrates as their fuel option. Again, as we mentioned, the effect of fats in a chronic sense as it relates to performance. Again, mixed reviews regarding the use of fats. Some have shown ergogenic benefits and others have not. So maybe we could do something. Some studies have looked at using a high fat diet for 10 days followed by a high carb diet in those few days leading up to an event. And the idea behind this would be to kind of upregulate fat burning enzymes and then kind of top off our carbohydrate stores in order to really top off the glycogen levels, so that you're kind of prepared for both scenarios. And again, that might be an effective way for us to potentially use this mechanism. So again, that high fat diet would help us to kind of upregulate those fat burning enzymes, and then also topping off the carbohydrate stores so that we have plenty of glycogen available for some sort of big endurance event. So that might be an option. So, so what are we seeing? Again, a lot of mixed reviews in this area. More research definitely needs to be done in order for us to really say definitively whether or not, a chronic high fat diet could be potentially helpful for an endurance athlete. And again, remember that when we say endurance athlete in this scenario, we mean that it has to be greater than, 90 minutes really in order for this to even be applicable. So following a period of high fat intake, fat oxidation might increase, but also we see the perception of effort during the exercise also increasing. Okay, so again, yes, we're able to upregulate those fat burning pathways. However, the athlete feels like they're working harder when doing that same intensity, so it might not be super beneficial. Now, there is a lot of newer research coming out now looking at the evidence of omega-3 supplementation and, fish oils, for example. So there are some benefits associated with using a fish oil supplement as it relates to reducing inflammation. And when we think about, inflammation and the use of this particular supplement, again, we can talk more about this in our supplements unit, but reducing inflammation can allow us to maybe recover quicker and then, therefore allow us to enhance performance because we're able to do more quality workouts kind of in a faster sequence. Okay, so again, as mentioned, definitely more research needs to be done in this area. So lastly, again, when we think about the use of chronic high-fat diets, certainly following more than 2 weeks of fat ingestion, there's no evidence that high-intensity activities are improved. Again, as we mentioned, the use of this particular type of diet for high-intensity exercise is not good, just simply by understanding the basics of metabolism. We know that in order to do high intensity exercise, we've got to have carbs. So it's easy for us to see that, using a high fat diet would be bad in those situations. Again, mixed reviews, whether or not it might be able to help some of those really true ultra endurance types of athletes. However, there are certainly some cons associated with that as well. So we think about this chronic high fat diet may not be recommended in the long term because of the health implications. So again, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, weight gain, high cholesterol, etc. So those are certainly some maybe negatives that outweigh the potential benefits associated with using a high fat diet. All right, that is it for today. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you next time.